Good evening. Oh, thank you. Good evening. Hi, my name is Yaniv Segal, and I'm the acting assistant conductor of the Detroit Symphony, and I'm very pleased to welcome fine composer Andrew Norman.
Hello.
You can't hear. Oh, I didn't speak into the mic. Okay, let's try that again. This is Andrew Norman, the composer for the second half piece. And my name is Yaniv Segal. Was that better? All right. I was like, ooh. So tonight's program is full of beautiful, exciting, and different music. I'll spend just a few minutes talking about our first half pieces, but then since Andrew's here, I think we'll spend most of the time talking about the piece on the second half called Play. So the music is connected in a way by time. Our first, well, the earliest composition on the program is Beethoven's Piano Concerto, number 1 in C. It's actually the second concerto he wrote, but it was published first, so it's known for us as his first. And it was written at the end of the 1700s, around 1790 or so. And then the work that precedes that, Dvorak's Carnival Overture, was written roughly a century later, in 1890. And then a little over 120 years later, we have Andrew's music. So you can look at the program tonight as snapshots of history. We have some incredibly famous composers with Beethoven and Dvorak, and one day Andrew. There's another theme that connects the works. The opening work is Carnival Overture, which is about joyous, raucous, playful times, and that relates to Andrew's music. And then the soloist for the Beethoven Piano Concerto is the phenomenal Emanuel Ax, and I believe he played a piece of yours.
Yes, I wrote a concerto for Mr. Ax 3 or 4 years ago.
There you go. So everything's tied together quite nicely. I don't need to spend too much time, I don't think, talking about Dvorak or Beethoven. They're very well known. The concerto is one of Beethoven's earliest or earlier works, and he wrote it for himself at the keyboard. It's influenced very much by Mozart and Haydn. It's a traditional concerto, except, of course, because it's Beethoven, he expands something, and in this case, it's the scope and the scale. It's probably 10 or 15 minutes longer than any concerto that Mozart wrote, for example. The cadenza in the first movement is epic. It feels like it's about 5 minutes long, and it's amazing. Also written by Beethoven. He would have improvised these cadenzas at the keyboard, and then when he started to go deaf and realized he wouldn't be able to perform anymore, he decided to write them down. So we have his cadenzas. That's what Manny's playing. The last movement of the concerto, very famous theme. If you aren't sure which concerto you're in, as soon as that last theme opens up, you'll know exactly where you are. So really great music on the first half, kind of the stalwart classics of the classical period and romantic period. And then in the second half, we have, let's call it a new take on a symphony by Andrew. It is epic in its own way. And before we talk about the music, maybe since you're here, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into composition, some influences, and things like that, and then we'll dive in.
Sure. Well, so I grew up playing the piano, and I also played the viola in school orchestra, and my family's not super musical, and I think I always thought of my instruments as a very creative space. I would spend hours a day playing them, but not necessarily hours a day practicing, which was...
I have to interrupt you right there. Where were you born?
Oh, I was born in Grand Rapids. Yeah, okay, awesome. So I'm a native of this state, though I moved away when I was very young, but I still have some family out here. So yeah, I think I was always a terrible practicer, but I love to improvise, and I love to make up things on the piano and on string instruments. And I started writing music when I was, well, a child. And then when I got to elementary school, junior high, I started writing for my string ensemble at school, and then the string orchestra, and then the full orchestra. And so I've always thought of writing orchestra music as being a communal activity because I always played in it. And when you play in the viola section in most orchestras, when you're kind of buried in the middle, you have this amazing sensation of hearing everything around you and not being terribly stressed out because you don't have as many notes to play as the first violins. So I had amazing experiences with the standard rep, kind of absorbing it all and all the sounds, and then I tried my hand at writing, and that sort of led to me going to music school, and eventually I stopped performing the piano and really just have focused my time on composition. And now, as of the last 4 or 5 years, I'm a professor at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles.
Right, and you were a student there too, right? So it's like going back home in some ways?
Yes.
And then you lived on the East Coast for a little while?
I did, and I've also lived in Europe, and I bounced around for a while, so I feel like I've gotten to see a number of different musical cultures out there.
So on behalf of everybody in Michigan, we apologize for the snow, being from Southern California, but you had to see it at least one day.
I think this is magical and exotic, so
Yeah, we think it's exotic in February, March, April.
I'm delighted.
Okay, so the music you write now is, I'll call it a little complicated, and I hope you didn't write like that for your student string orchestra back in high school and so forth. Okay, what influenced your music, and had you pursue directions exploring sound?
Sure. Well, so maybe for the last actually couple decades or so, I've been interested in how we process sound and also how we process ideas in sound. And the sort of, you might say, the rate at which ideas unfold in a symphonic composition is something that I find very fascinating. You know, in a work like a symphony of Beethoven, it's almost like you're getting a view into Beethoven's brain and how Beethoven is working with material and how he's moving through different ideas. And I also have been wondering about how our brains might be different than the brains of people 100 or 200 years ago because of the ways that technology has influenced us. It's something I've given a lot of thought to lately about how social media and how the constant presence of our phones and the internet and this sort of constant bombardment of tiny little fragments of information has actually maybe changed the way that we think. I see this in my students, actually. I'm old enough to remember a time before the internet, which is not true for any of my college freshmen and sophomores. And I do think that there's a way that this has changed the way that they think and the speed at which they think. And so I'm interested in trying to find a pace of ideas that is reflective of and kind of exploring how our world works, which is another way to say that this music is incredibly fast and very dense. And it's filled with super abrupt changes. And it's kind of like entering a chaotic web of material and not a focused, clear line of thought.
Great, so maybe we should talk a little bit then about this piece so that we can put this in context, and then we'll revisit kind of the process a little bit more.
Sure.
So it's a piece in 3 movements. I called it maybe a symphony. The movements are not called movement 1, 2, and 3, but levels 1, 2, and 3. So some cultural references there. And this is not the type of piece that you'll go home humming.
No.
Okay.
We can get that
out of the way. There are many, many beautiful moments. There are also many scary moments. And kind of, you know, Andrew just mentioned the abrupt shift of character. I think if you imagine you are sitting on a couch with a TV remote, which our students don't use anymore even, and I think they don't know what channel surfing is, But if you're channel surfing at hyperspeed and everything is really loud and on fast forward, some of this music feels that way.
Awesome. I will say, in case this all sounds scary,
don't be scared.
Another one of my influences actually is the music of Carl Stalling, and I don't know if you know who this composer is, but he wrote all of the old Looney Tunes scores.
Yeah, that makes sense now.
And if you listen to old cartoon scores, they're absolutely amazing because they're hyper virtuosic, and if you listen to them without watching the image, they move incredibly fast. And they're, in these old cartoons, I think of Tom and Jerry too. It's like the changes in character and quality are from second to second to second. It's music that is totally mercurial in its way of being. And when we watch it with a film, it kind of blows by us. We don't really even notice. But to focus on that by itself is, I think, there's something quite radical in this music. So yes, the music does at times feel like one might be flipping through some channels, or surfing the internet or something. I think for me, one of the important things, I thought of this piece as a big, long journey. It's in 3 movements. The second and third are actually kind of connected, so it really almost feels like 2 things. But I definitely wanted to think of some long kind of narrative ideas that would come through. And one of them is going from chaos to order. So the symphony opens, and it's kind of like I throw everything I can possibly throw at them and at you. And sort of the process of that 45 minutes is then watching all of that material sort itself out. And so if you feel perhaps lost or disoriented by this music in the first movement, that's totally okay. You are exactly where I want you to be. But just know that every single little thing that happens is part of some larger story. It's almost like I took several reels of film and chopped them all up and kind of rearranged them as a collage. So every little thing that happens is part of some much bigger thing, but many of those things don't become clear or extended until the end of the piece. So there's definitely a movement from tiny little chunks of ideas to the end of the piece, which the entire last movement is just one idea. It's kind of a single, long unfolding. It's kind of the thing that everyone's been trying to make but failing to make throughout the whole work. So it's definitely loaded towards the end in terms of more traditional musical content.
Right, and that's hard to hear on the first listening. I will say that. Most pieces that we've never heard before is hard to get everything, whether it's Beethoven or Brahms or Tchaikovsky. Many of the works which we love today, as we know, had tumultuous premieres or early lives until people got used to hearing it and understanding what was going on. There is a recording of a different version of this piece available, correct? Yes, I've been rewriting this piece. The first version was about 5 years ago, and I've rewritten it many times since to try to get it to be what I want it to be. This is also quite typical of many composers like Mahler or Bruckner, who edited and rewrote and looked for exactly what they heard in their head, and how to get that on paper is quite difficult. What sort of things are you rewriting or working on in something like this? Well, issues of clarity, I think, and also making sure that all these little snippets of material are sort of saying exactly what I want them to say, and when I want an idea to sort of come to the foreground, even if it's very briefly, I want that to be clear. So in some ways, I actually wrote the piece more or less backwards, because I wrote this goal that everything is moving toward first, and then it became a kind of exercise in storytelling and kind of foreshadowing and giving you little hints of the various pieces of this final unfolding. And so part of editing and re-editing it has been just seeing how I can manipulate all those little moments of foreshadowing to the end. Okay, let me ask, I'm going to ask two more questions, and then we can go from there. The first one will be about the title. Sure. And then the second one is about the actual language of what the musicians have before them, because some of that is what we would call extended technique and so forth. So why don't we talk about why it's called play, and what's at play here?
Yeah. So I often when I'm writing music, I will start to think of key words that sort of guide my creative process, and usually during the process of writing, I will narrow it down to a single concept that I feel like kind of says the most about what I'm trying to explore and say. And I came up with play for this piece. I like the word; it has many meanings. It hints at this kind of rambunctious playfulness. It is a very kind of physical or kinetic kind of play, or sort of rowdy play. In fact, one early reviewer said that the beginning of the symphony was like opening a door on a room of hyper-caffeinated toddlers. So it definitely has that aspect. I was also thinking about how people play instruments, and in a way, this is a piece that really tries to explore all the many, many ways all of these amazing instruments can be played. And there's everything from very normal traditional playing to some kind of crazy non-traditional kinds of sound making on the instruments. And so it was really, and also an exploration of the theatricality of playing. So it's a very physical piece, particularly for the strings, in the ways that they approach their instrument. And I often ask them to do things like freeze in place, or move their bows but not make any sound. And this is all to sort of highlight the expressiveness of their bows and their bodies as they're playing, which I've always been sort of mesmerized by in an orchestra. But there's another meaning of the word play, which I was thinking about, which is a slightly darker meaning, and it has to do with the idea of control or manipulation, and it is related a little bit to video games, but also if you think of the expression we say sometimes, oh, he got played. I don't know, it's a thing you hear, which means that someone was being manipulated by someone else in kind of a chess game kind of a way. It means someone was outmaneuvered or someone was controlled. And I really started to explore this idea of control, and who in the orchestra is controlling whom, and what does it mean to ask someone else to play something, actually. And I sort of thought of this chain of control. You know, it starts with me, who writes notes on a page. It goes to the conductor, who in a way I'm controlling, because everything that I've put in the score he is doing, and then he is controlling the section leaders who control their sections. So there's definitely a sort of chain going through the piece of people controlling other people. And what I decided to do was actually add another layer, sort of metaphorical layer of control, which is that each of the percussion instruments in the back does something very specific to the other instruments in the orchestra. They act like triggers, so that a certain drum will stop everyone, and another drum will start everyone. And the triangle, for instance, freezes everyone in place, and another hit of the triangle will unfreeze them. So it's as if the percussionists are kind of like these sort of marionette puppet master kind of people who are controlling all sorts of activities all throughout the orchestra. And then for me, the story then is, how does the rest of the ensemble deal with this, and how do they eventually overcome this to sort of make the music they've been trying to make? So that is the very long answer of why the piece is called Play.
The percussion thing is very cool. It's hard to catch all of what goes on at once, but there'll be a few demonstrations before the piece, so you can hear some of these sounds. But it's very cool when there's a triangle, and all of a sudden the music just stops, and it might happen pretty quickly sometimes, or you might have a second or two or five to realize that you're in one of these controlled moments. There are some moments where it sounds like the entire orchestra is accelerating and accelerating. That's another controlled thing, right? Mm-hmm. So the percussion does something, and it sounds like you've put your tape on fast forward. And that's exactly what's going on. Or there's music that you hear go in one direction, and then there's a trigger that has them play the same thing backwards. Very hard to hear these things as they're coming flying at you, so come back again tomorrow. And yes, actually, the score is so complicated, it's all written out in the parts, right? So the piccolo player doesn't say in his part, now play that backwards when you hear that note. You've done them the favor of writing it all out, right?
Yeah, yes.
It is planned.
Yeah, it is. And I will say that I had this image of like being trapped inside a Rube Goldberg machine, of one of these, these crazy mechanical things, like one of those marble run things where it's filled with all sorts of levers and devices and things reacting to other things and things causing other things to happen. And the piece definitely, as particularly when it starts, it's like getting trapped at warp speed, and as it goes, it kind of gradually, as I've said, sort of sorts itself out. So yeah, don't be alarmed if you can't hear any of that stuff. But it was, for me, it's great fun. It's kind of like inventing a universe, and a universe with a whole bunch of rules. Like every time this happens, then this other thing happens, and then I get to sort of play around in that universe for a while. Making all sorts of things happen. And yes, at the beginning it is playful, but gradually also the piece becomes less and less playful as it goes, because this sense of perhaps being trapped becomes more prevalent, or at least that's what I was hoping for, until there's a moment of release at the end.
Now, some things you might notice if you are watching carefully is that you might hear a violin playing, but you can't actually see them playing, or a cello or a viola and so forth. And that's because nearly every member of the orchestra tonight has a solo. The melodies get passed from one instrument to another, and composite melodies are created from the whole section, right?
Yeah, it's something, as a former youth orchestra player, I'm always, when I go to orchestra concerts now, I always wonder about people's playing. And you get a sense of maybe the principal oboes playing or the principal trumpets playing, because they get to play by themselves. But I always wonder about all those section players who I know in an orchestra like this are absolutely amazing. And so it's something I've been interested in my orchestral writing, is trying to give even tiny little moments just to every one of those string players to just sort of be themselves. And without giving away too much of the ending, I will say that this piece ends with a gesture that is both communal and individual, because every single one of the string players plays exactly one note by themselves at the end of this piece, and it creates a kind of composite line from all those solos. And that was something I knew from the beginning that I wanted to do, to sort of say, after the craziness of all this, yes, these people can actually make something together. And it's actually a moment that's also unconducted. So our amazing conductor, Christy, will put down his baton, and then these players just make the thing themselves. So it is, I think there's something also very vulnerable about playing by yourself, especially if that's not normally your role in an orchestra concert.
Yeah, it's quite a beautiful, great ending, actually. So that's one of, as I said, many special, beautiful moments. You have a great ear for the sound and color of an orchestra. And we were talking about how many composers use sound to create this narrative. And I think you get to hear today, in the first half, the more traditional creation of some kind of discord and then harmony, or dissonance and consonance, whereas Andrew is using, yes, he uses plenty of traditional Western notes to create melodies and lines, but your piece relies more on other worlds in order to create the structure. Now, how do you find these sounds? They're incredible. Like, for example, at some point, the strings players move their hands rapidly up and down the fingerboard. So maybe you've heard a guitar player playing, and you hear the sounds of the strings as they're changing notes, but not actually strumming. So it's a little bit of that effect as an entire section moves in unison up and down the fingerboard. Who thinks of things like this?
I did. No, but that comes from me goofing off at home on my viola and finding ways of approaching the instrument that...
There has to be a viola joke in here, right?
The whole world is a viola joke for me, but no, I find so much of our training, especially as string players, is about being able to replicate something perfectly a zillion times, to absolutely control the bow and your left arm and your left hand as well, in these very specific ways to create a 1000% beautiful sound all the time. And one thing I'm interested in is, yes, exploring those beautiful sounds, but also just widening the sort of view just a little bit, and what happens when you go outside of that particular kind of bow speed and pressure that creates a beautiful sound. What does that do, and how can those sounds also be interesting or expressive? Or, yes, there's this moment where they play by sliding their left hands on the fingerboard, and it's a very, very quiet sound. And that was, to me, it's an interesting sound, but it's also an interesting visual effect to see string players kind of shifting in unison without using their bows. But I would never just do these sounds to be sounds. I always want them to be expressive in the larger picture of what I'm trying to say. And I always want them to be kind of important. I think that you can construct a journey or a narrative out of any kind of material, and this one involves oftentimes material which is doesn't relate to pitch in the same way that the great tunes and harmonies of the Western classical canon do, but nevertheless I think that these sounds are important to what I'm trying to say, and also a one piece of this journey that will take us somewhere, hopefully.
Yeah, and I think this is another thing about the word play, is the playful aspect. That some of the things the musicians do made us all laugh during rehearsals, and absolutely that was the intent. And if you think about, I have young kids and how they hear music or how they experience sound, and when they hear something that they've never heard before, they don't think to themselves, that's not music. They just think it's funny or fun or exciting or different. So in a way, opening up the world to include more sounds and more creative ways of playing is exactly that childlike exuberance brought to life through your music. So I think that's really fun.
Awesome. So just channel your inner 3-year-old.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we'll all be okay.
And unfortunately, I mistimed it, and we don't have time for questions this evening because I have to get off the stage by 7:30, so that our musicians can warm up. But hopefully this introduces you a little bit more and prepares you for this awesome music on tonight's concert. And please, let's have another warm welcome for Andrew Norman.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.